So my friends, welcome to this week's episode of the Empyraeum blog. I'm trying to keep it a weekly thing. It's not always easy with my crazy personal and working schedule, as well as my creative schedule. My creative schedule has been a bit sporadic and a bit overly excessive at times, but I'm trying to keep it going. It's one of the important things as a writer you need to try and do. This week we're going to be talking about character and characterization. And I'd like to start with an anecdote that's going to lead into something else. But first of all, I would like to say quite categorically and clearly, I try and keep politics out of my blog and out of my personal book related things, but what happened to Jacob Blake has no justification, it has no explanation, it has no precedent in law that it was the right thing to happen, and I'm praying and thinking and hoping for his family that he makes a full recovery, because watching that video scared the living hell out of me, and I really hope something positive is going to come soon, because it's getting bad. I'm a stepfather to black children. My wife is black, my children are of mixed race. And I never want them to experience even close to what that man did and what black people in America are experiencing at the moment. And I don't care how political it's becoming. It's not a political thing. It's a basic human thing. And that's all I'm going to say on the matter at the moment. This is not a political blog, but these are my opinions. This is my platform. I can say as I like, and if I lose a few subscribers over it, so be it. I would like to start this, and thank you for listening to that. I'll go into the main body of the blog at the moment now, that being of characterization, and it does bear mentioning that the anecdote I'm going to mention is also somewhat politically charged. A good friend of mine, who is an editor, actually said if we were writing the kind of villains that we're seeing on the television screen at the moment, our editors would tell us to go back and revise those scenes. And I'll leave that there. I'm sure you know what I'm talking about, and if you don't like it, again, those who know me well will know that when I say tough, that's exactly what I think. What people think of me personally has rarely been a concern of mine. But yes, I would like to talk today about the idea of characterization. It's something I see a lot of questions, a lot of interest, and a lot of requests for guidance on a lot of the writing groups and blogs. I see it a great deal. And the first thing I want to mention about the idea of characterization is you do not, or you are not, under any form of pressure or any form of obligation to include any particular groups of people in your work. You do not have to represent the trans community, you do not have to represent the LGBTQA plus 2. I can't remember. If I got that wrong, I apologize. I try and keep up with how things are going. You do not have to include people of any particular ethnic origin if they do not belong in the universe. Right, of course, keeping it current is important. Your political views as a person, your philosophical and deep-seated views are going to come out in your writing. That is impossible to avoid. But you don't have to put in what I like to call tokens just in order to have them there. Because they will be, if you do it for that reason, you're going to write a very two-dimensional and probably somewhat stereotypical character if you're not familiar with that community of people. Now, say the Chronicles of Enoch, our sister series, does include people of a very varied ethnic origins, but that's because they belong in the setting in which the Chronicles of Enoch take place. It's set in Atlanta, Georgia, which is a very ethnically diverse area, a very ethnically diverse state. Not in all parts, but in the Atlanta metro and the surrounding areas, it's very ethnically diverse. I remember when I first got to Atlanta and I was taking a look around with my then partner, we had taken a look around and realised that it was in little sectors. You had a sector of various South American various South American cultures. You had a Cuban area with all Cuban restaurants and Cuban food shops. You had a Puerto Rican area with the same thing. You had a Jamaican area. You had a Chinese, Japanese, and various Asian cultures together. You had an Indian area. Indian as in people from India, the place that Columbus was in fact looking for. And it was incredible. We could have spent the whole day just wandering around these representations of different cultures. It was fantastic, and that was when I decided I liked this, because we've been living in Albuquerque. Before that, Albuquerque is, shall we say, not very racially diverse at all. You have either white Americans or people of Hispanic origin, and that's about it, or people who are mixed. It was changing, of course, just like everywhere, but it wasn't a very racially diverse city for quite some time. And I do enjoy diversity, because that's what really adds a bit of flavour and excitement and joy to a place. Most people don't realise diversity, when it belongs, adds a lot of flavour and interest. And I'm not just talking about racial diversity, I'm talking about all kinds of diversity, and we'll get onto that later. I'm just going off on a tangent about Atlanta, because I did love the place, I'll be honest. I loved Albuquerque. Albuquerque's cool because you have so much native influence in Albuquerque, which I deeply enjoyed, but it's kind of shushed off to one side, which is an awful shame. But I'm not against diversity in writing in any way, shape or form, as long as it belongs, and as long as you at least do some research. Obviously a lot of my characters in the Chronicle Enoch are based on real people I've met in Atlanta, or amalgams of people I've met, or not stereotypes in any way, shape or form. And I'm not going to have that. I'm not going to give any form of legitimacy to stereotypes. So many stereotypes came from somewhere, but I'm not going to add to them. Now, obviously, Empyraeum is a little less diverse in some ways, but those of you who have been paying attention have realised not so much as you think, because the whole idea of the Empyraeum is that back in the original, if we're looking at the Kal Shadar and the Dracograph, back in the time that Alexander was expanding his empire, his army was, as I like to call it, the cultural melting pot. It was people from everywhere were joining that army, people from the Near East, from the Far East, from everywhere, and I just haven't got round to creating those characters yet. Doesn't mean they're not going to appear. Obviously, you've seen that there's a Mandinka Kal Shadar leading the Sons of Nemesis, and that's just because not because I wanted to put him in there, it's just he fitted the role. I don't know why, but when I was coming up with a name and the basics of his character, he just turned out that way. That is Akora. Akora is going to be that character and that origin, just because that fits who he is. And it's just how he does things. And that's the thing I'm trying to say to you. You don't want to try and shoehorn particular ethnicities, particular communities into your work. You need to let them come out naturally. You need to let them form naturally. You need to let them belong and make sure. You need to let them form naturally, organically, and on their own. Because what we're trying to do here, the most important thing that we're trying to do as writers, is make our characters natural and believable. Make them rounded and three-dimensional. And as much, my hair's a mess on that, I really need to get it cut. Anyone got any ideas? I'm thinking of actually buying one of those clipper things and tidying it up a little bit and just letting the wife, and if she ruins it, I can buy a hat. It's not going to be the end of the world, is it? But you need to let your characters, you need to let them form naturally, you need to let them form organically, and you need to let them develop in their own ways. It's one of those strange things. Come up with characters, I find, as a parallel, is like being a parent, that you give them direction, you give them form, and you point them in certain ways and instruct them. But then when those things are set, you let them develop on their own. And many writers have said to me that characters, and I've seen it myself, characters just seem to blossom and form on their own. And it's not anything magical or strange that's happening. It's just the fact that the characteristics that you set down, the rules that you invoked in creating them, and the idea that's forming inside of your head flourished once you encouraged it. Now, I often joke that Asmodeus in the Chronicles of Enoch and Sham in Empyraeum hijacked their position. They started as minor characters, but they were just way too interesting a concept to leave unexplored. So naturally, once I experimented a little with them, I found that, hey, I like these guys, I'm going to make them more important. And it worked out well. Now, why I made Sham Indian, the idea for Sham came that Alexander had an Indian sage who followed him, a philosopher and sage, who followed him on his campaigns and died in Babylon after committing ritual suicide. And that was one of the many events that led to Alexander's eventual mental collapse and downfall. And I thought, well, how about I play with this, but I change it a little bit? And suddenly he became the crux around which everything span. He became the focus of the entire storyline. Now, he'd existed in embryonic form in the now abandoned Trinity series, which I'm not going to take anywhere because it's going to go its own way within the Empyraeum series. It's part of the Empyraeum series now. But the important thing when you're writing characters is to let them be themselves. Anyone who's been regularly following the Empyraeum blog knows that I have a number of voices who partake in the Empyraeum blog, and I will let you into a secret, they're not real. That's just me experimenting with characterization and seeing if I can keep their personality and their style of expressing themselves, and a style which is recognizably them, alive, and maintain it in a way that people know this is a different character. I've got, 4 or 5 contributors to the blog, and I'll be honest, they're all me. They're not other people. I do it all. But it's playing around with characterization, because this is a thing that's important that I'm leading up to. When you're writing characters, you need to use this metaphor that I was given, or this manner of thinking that I was given by a very talented and famous writer who I will not name drop. But he said to me, in order to see if your character has their own voice, you need to imagine you're sitting in a room with 4 or 5 of your characters sat on chairs, in the stereotype that you see for many different therapy groups and things like that. Close your eyes and listen to the conversation. And if you can tell who is who, just like you could in real life with people that you are familiar with, then you're finding that character's voice and developing them well. And I've experimented with this in a number of different formats of removing what we call the dialogue qualifiers, where there are obviously each character has their line of dialogue going down the page, and removing the dialogue qualifiers so that to see whether it's obvious who is speaking that line without keeping a mental tally of who last spoke, and then therefore who should be next. And it's like with everybody has their own tone of voice, they have their own little idiosyncrasies of speech, they have their own terminology and their own way of saying things. Your characters have to be the same, but you have to through developing their character, you develop what idiosyncrasies of speech, what accent, what manner of speaking they're going to have, because it is your personality, your manner of thinking, and your background which influence how you speak. Now, my accent is funny, you wouldn't know with me, but both of my parents still have quite noticeable Belfast accents. My grandmother still does as well. I grew up in England, and both my sister and I have hard to define English accents that are nothing to do with the accents my parents have, though we can understand and, after a few drinks, emulate said accent. But we developed our own accents over a period of time where I can alter my accent depending who I'm talking to and my style of manner of speech. But that's just because I'm a kind of weird social chameleon. I pick up accents and ways of behaving very, very quickly. It's always been that way, I just don't know why. But you pick up little things. I pick up little things. Let's use an example. Alexander is, down at his core, quite an insecure person who seeks approval. He initially sought his father's approval. Then once his father died, he had no way of knowing if he truly had that approval, and that left him a little adrift, and he attached himself to Hephaestion in what may or may not have been a homosexual relationship that they shared. I leave that open to interpretation, though obviously sometimes I'm a little direct in mentioning that's what it may have been, but he then sought Hephaestion as a source of approval. If he was doing well, Hephaestion would approve and love him more. And it took a long time for him to realise the toxicity of that relationship, and over time he has developed to realise that he doesn't need the approval of anyone. Gosh, he's the king of the known world. Whose approval does he require? But even so, someone who's the ruler of the entire world, effectively immortal and very powerful, why does he need people's approval? Because people are people, regardless of who they are. And I've got a right mixture of characters in there. I've got Lupanikis, who is compensating for past failures. I've got Caldiades, who's using humour to hide his deeper insecurities and depression. I've got Sham, who is blaming himself for the current state of the world. I've got Gabriel, who's on the run from himself. I've got Nesha, who's trying to reconcile his violent actions in the past with what he's doing. I've got Korai, who everyone thinks is a bit of a stereotype, who is in fact trying to make friends and be accepted, because he was always the one who stands out and the tall, massive, ugly bloke who everyone laughs at. And already I've got quite a mixture of people, and I haven't even got into the rest of them yet. You know, we've got Sean Ollimur, who is trying to live up to the ghosts of his past and be a good soldier, even though he's more of a book-learned kind of person. As it turns out, he might be quite a heroic character. We don't know yet. Well, I do, but you don't. And you see, as you go through life, you meet all kinds of people. In fact, you may even become yourself all kinds of people through the progression of your personality. But that's not to say that you have to include them all in there. But you notice there are, my favourite activity in the world in many ways is people watching. I love being in a public place and watching everybody and trying to figure out why they do what they do and how they do what they do and everything like that. And I think that's just a natural inclination that people of a creative and writerly disposition have, or persuasion, should I say. And a lot of people say as well that your characters represent aspects of you, and I suppose there's something to that. There are parts of me in some of my characters. Calliades shares some of my traits, Sham shares others. Many people have said Gabriel is effectively me, with a few differences. And maybe he is. some of the experiences I've had that, shall we say, are less conventional and less able to be explained scientifically, I did graft onto Gabriel's character, I will admit. Obviously, a lot of the more dramatic and exciting ones about the Trinity got nothing to do with it. I am no 400-year-old immortal or anything like that, capable of amazing martial skill and all that sort of thing, not even slightly. I just am not. I'm just a normal guy who's getting old like everyone else is, who has problems. But we all dream of the immortal, don't we? That's why, I suppose that's part of the reason I like to write about immortals, because I know people like them. I just try and make mine a little more original than the run-of-the-mill. But I'm including a lot of mortals in the Empyraeum Cycle, and they're important. You'll see that once the Empyraeum Cycle Trilogy comes out, it's not necessarily going to be the immortals who are driving the story. They're going to be an important part of it. But I feel it's important to have them stand back and let the mortals have their space, because a lot can be said for having a short span of life, or 410, and knowing that's all we've got, and then we've got to make as much of it as we possibly can, to knowing you've got all the time in the world saving a catastrophic accident, that you have this amount of time to achieve as much as you possibly can, and maybe not even that. Especially the ones that are involved in the military of the Empyreum, they know that their next engagement could be their last, and that of course is going to influence their character also. You've got the members of the Panastas who know that they are in a very dangerous profession, as it were, that every day they are resisting the Union could be the last that they do so, or that any day now Keepers or Prometheans could descend on their hidden base and wipe them out. They don't know when that's going to happen. They just try and do everything they can to make sure every day they live counts. And it's what we were talking about before, about the whole idea of conflict. That's a new word. I'm going to invent that. I like to complicate things. But context and setting, of adding the conflict, that's what I was thinking of, and that's why I mixed the two words up, you see. That the pushing conflict on people means that they are under pressure to do something that they could normally take a long time and think about, under pressure. And it is conflict that reveals who somebody truly is. You can have a character who tells everyone how wonderful and strong and brave and decisive they are, who will dissolve into a blubbering, terrified mess under conflict, under pressure. You can have someone who's quiet and thoughtful, who doesn't speak out loud, who doesn't boast, who will blossom and flower under pressure and conflict. And that's what you're trying to reveal in your character development, of how that realistically happens. And you see that while I am separating different aspects of the writing process in these videos, truly you cannot, any more than you can take one of your characters in isolation of the others. Any way you can take one of your characters in isolation of the conflict, of the context and the setting. You just can't do it. They are intrinsically linked. You cannot take a person that you know or that you have encountered in isolation of their life and their experiences, because each makes the other. You may say we're genetically predisposed to behave in a certain way, but how those personality traits that you have picked up through your genetics, through your upbringing, manifest themselves depend what influences you've had through life, what experiences. You may, going into the whole parallel dimensions and parallel worlds and quantum aspect of things. Quantum, it's science fiction, I have to mention quantum at least once. It's the law. Ask around, it's very, very true. all these things, you could have multiple versions of yourself out there, but how are you ever going to know? What you've got right now is a you that you have, and if you think it's less than perfect, welcome to the club. There are several billion of us out there that think the same thing on a daily basis. Even the ones that claim they don't are lying. Everyone doubts themselves, everyone thinks they could be better in this way or the other. Doesn't matter who they are, the ones who most vociferously deny it are the ones who are most prey to its touch, is what I say. And that's another thing I want to bring up as we start to wrap this episode up. Vulnerability, don't be worried about leaving it in, about adding that in there. Every being on the face of this earth has experienced vulnerability at some point in their lives, and probably on a regular basis. Everyone has doubts. Everyone questions themselves. The fact that you do is normal. The fact that your character should is, in addition, is normal. If you're going to present your characters, presenting a perfect, unquestioning, undoubting, invulnerable character is going to produce a very two-dimensional character. Conversely, having someone who goes through a great deal of trauma and trial and then just seems to brush it off and carry on and become heroic is also unrealistic, because that does not happen in real life. It's great to believe it's possible, but it doesn't happen. Look, as an example, about all these people who've attained great fame, great fortune, great acclaim. Heath Ledger as a prime example. And then gone to lose everything. Heath Ledger, Robin Williams, Richard Pryor. So many of the greats. River Phoenix. They appear to have everything, but to them, clearly they don't. And there's a lesson in that. You cannot have a fearless, invulnerable person who is immune to what's going on around them. You have to introduce realism into your characters, or you're wasting your time writing. You cannot have someone who, even, let's just say the villain. People say there are two camps on this. They're going too much into the villain's motivations and making them human is a good thing. Some say some is a bad thing, say others. That a faceless villain who you cannot understand the motivations of is a lot scarier than a vulnerable villain who, there but for the grace of God go I. Now, that depends on your story. I can tell you, and you've probably seen hints at this, that at least one of the villains in the Empyraeum saga is going to be there but for the grace of God go I kind of people. Apateion is a complex and interesting character, and I'm looking forward to exploring him a little bit more. Those of you who read The Charmer of Snakes before I finished writing it, before I finished editing it, or before I withdrew it in order to edit it, already may have had a hint at what his vulnerability is. Those of you who are waiting for the edited and improved version, I'm not going to change much about him. There's going to be little changes. And the Charmer of Snakes doesn't need many changes. It's fairly good as it is. Skander Draco is one that's going to get most changes, but these are going to be small. Those scenes that you enjoyed in Skander Draco are still going to be there, and I'm only going to change little small things, because to do much more would be changing the pace too much, and I'm not going to do it. It's mainly changing grammar and structure a little bit. I was a bit unhappy with how it came together, and don't be afraid to do that. But I'm going to leave you today, because we're approaching the 30-minute mark, and I always try and keep within that as much as I can. I'll leave you today with just thinking about that your characters have to be people. You have to make them as much as possible real and believable people, or your readers will not be capable of relating to them, and that's what you want. For people your readers will be loyal to and want to read about, you have to make them as relatable as possible. And the thing I mentioned before in context, the whole thing of the fatal flaw for which Shakespeare was popular, have those. Experiment, play, and work with different traits and different ways of behaving and help that character find its voice. And if you're really struggling for it, little tip that I've always used and that I found very useful. If you're struggling to develop your character, write a short story just about them. Take an aspect that they mention about themselves in the main work and write that short story about them. And you may or may not believe this, but that is where the Empyraeum Novellas came from. They were originally set out as character studies. You know, that Scandor Draco was going to be about Alexander, though it turned out about being about everybody. And then you see each subsequent novella, we have Lupernikis, we have Nesha, we have Sham, and we go back to Alexander. Each one is focusing on different people, and most people don't realise Scandor Draco is predominantly about Kaliadis. Though Kaliadis is not the title character, he has the most scenes and dialogue in that book. Though it's not directly about him, he is still the dominant character. And there's a reason behind that. So I developed my characters by putting them in interesting situations and seeing what they'd do. I highly recommend you do the same if you're struggling with some of your characters. Let's say you've got a character of, I don't know, let's say they're a lawyer. Put them in a situation where they cannot win a case that could be vital to their future well-being or career. Put them in jail for something they did or didn't do. Have a doctor who's never lost a patient lose a patient. Have an idealist who is forced, in order to protect their family or someone they love, have to decide whether to betray their principles or not. Put them in the Batman dilemma. Think of something completely outside of your story and see how they behave in it, and you will actually find, if you've worked on your character well enough, they will shape that to fit your story. Because I'll be honest, the Gabriel and Sham, and Unity, of course, the immigrants from the Trinity series and transplants into Empyraeum, their story and their characters really didn't fit Empyraeum at all. And the odd thing is that they blended in seamlessly after a little bit of retconning, just changing a few things, and everything else just fit into place. You can do that too. If you've got old characters that you really love but just couldn't get them to work, see if you can introduce them into your current work and if they flourish there or not. It's a way of practicing characterization, making real rounded people. Because for me, one of the greatest compliments I received from a respected writer was a little comment. I published I think it was a Facebook post on Asmodeus when I still had Facebook, and they actually said, I feel like I know him. I feel like there's something about him that I recognise. And that meant I had written a character who felt like a real person. And in my opinion, there is no greater a compliment we can receive as writers than that. That for someone to come up to me in years, months, when I'm famous and exciting and windswept and interesting, for someone to come up and say, Gabriel's me. I feel like he's the person I want to be. And it won't be that Gabriel is some fictional character that I drew out of my head, that Gabriel has become an archetype that people can identify with. And that is what we're aiming for. And that also is where I'll leave you, my friends, for this week. And thank you again for watching. I will look forward to trying to see you again next week. Enjoy, stay safe, stay protected, And please be careful out there, because this world is becoming an increasingly dangerous place. I'm feeling I can't write dystopian quickly enough to take account of what's going out in the going on out there in the real world. See, I'm so emotionally charged by it I cannot even put the words together. Be careful, my friends, and I will see you next week. Take care, and thank you.